Beef over on Netflix. Finally wrapped it up, saw the whole season. I did a little quick video on like my first impression. This was a show that was very highly recommended by a couple of you folks, and I appreciate that. The show is not terrible; it's pretty good. Have a lot of issues with it. It's not my thing in the sense of I can't see myself going back and rewatch it. My first impression was that you end up with like one of these shows where it's just a lot of like it's just us watching bad people do bad things. I will say it just took a little bit of time for some of the consequences to sort of like chase down some of the characters, but really the show makes like a very abrupt turn kind of in the middle of the show where um there's like a major time jump. Like it just has this just major time jump. And it was kind of almost like abrupt and weird that it did that. Like, so the first 6 episodes, go along, get us to a certain point, and then all of a sudden, before the last four, it's 8 months later. So it's almost like I got to be honest, I felt almost like it was like two different shows. Like it's 1 through 6, and then it's 7 because the pace seemed differently. How they approached the two main characters changed radically, and kind of like the whole incident and consequences thing sort of shifts dramatically. So, premise of the show is the road rage show, right? So you have, I know, I'm supposed to call them by their names. Steven, I'm having a bad day. You're having a bad day. Honks, flipping people off, all that kind of stuff. But it turns like crazy, and everything kind of gets amped up to 11, 12, 13, right? He takes down the license number, then he kind of stalks her and does something. Then she gets his license number and she kind of hits him back. And that's kind of how the show sort of kicked off and kind of navigated through the first couple episodes. But what was weird was it sort of is dragging along a lot of innocent players and characters that I didn't necessarily really care much about, especially early on, like Amy's husband, George, who was just basically like this very submissive husband with all of this sort of like like yuppie and hippie California talk about his feelings and all that, but he's really into his daughter and he's really trying to be a good dad. He's very naive at times, things like that. Then you have Paul, who's like Danny thinks is like a complete loser and doesn't have it together, but in some ways he's just young and kind of naive. He seems also like a very good intentioned kid, and Amy turns her eyes on him, like trying to catfish him. And it was kind of a strange little turn I didn't necessarily see coming. Right now, as things sort of derail through this first half, right? Um, Basically, a lot of this centers around Amy and Paul, right? Because she decides to actually meet him. He steals the truck. In the meantime, the cousin. So the other character that's really important to understand is his cousin named Isaac, and Isaac has been running. He's a criminal. He's been running illegal stuff, and he was doing it out of the family motel business. And they lost the business, so the parents go back to Korea. He's been in jail, but now he's out. Well, Danny can't escape Isaac either, and Isaac is always like a wild card in Danny's approach to things. Like you're never quite sure. So it's Danny always keeps throwing gasoline on the fire, but sometimes I don't think he means to, but he always ends up leaning on Isaac, who always has like crazy stuff that just makes it worse. Right now, there's chase sequences and all sorts of different fighting. This culminates with them going to Las Vegas because that's where Amy and Paul are, and then they get caught there. So it just ends up putting Isaac back behind bars again. They think he did the road rage thing. It's complicated stuff that just kind of keeps going and going and going, right? And then it sort of kind of comes to the point where Amy is going to start doing evil things within the family, even, right? Taking out the mom. So it's like George's mom is sort of kind of onto everything, but Amy's going to like put her in the crosshairs, right? Because Amy's entire thing is about this deal, selling the business and all this money and whatever. And it's weird because they want us to like her as a mom, right? And oh, she's doing this so she can be home with this kid. And it's like, well, she's never in a scene with this kid. George is. So I never bought in the fact that Amy's intentions were well intentioned. It just seems like the thing that was an excuse to sell the business and make a bunch of money and live kind of like a wine mom, not because she's a good mom. Like the daughter is always with George. George is the one that's good. George is the one that's caught in, but George is always like naive and really kind of a sad, pathetic sack, to be honest. Like I'm just never impressed by George. Um, so that kind of takes us through most of the first half of the season where things are just kind of um, getting worse and worse. But then what's weird is even Danny's doing the same thing. So again, they're trying to set it up so they're mirrors. I get it, but all of a sudden Danny turns Isaac in. Like he basically does the anonymous phone call bit, and he's tied to the road rage, so therefore Isaac goes back to jail. So all this turns into a big mess. And then episode 7 lands, and you're like 8 months later, and you're like, what? And Amy's deal went through. They live in a lap of luxury in this vacation home. They have a nanny. Um, Now you have Danny, who's like, he's at the church, and the guy, oh, by the way, I didn't get to the church thing. So the church stuff is really very cringe for me because I am a person of faith, and some of those elements I think were positive, and I didn't care for like the faking of the church type stuff. And then it's sort of like Edwin, who's like this praise person in church, where has this basketball thing. And even though he's threatened, because Danny's like the wife's ex, it's like F and F and F. And so he's out of the loop. He's out of the club. Right. And now you end up with Danny and all this happening. And then there's a house fire. Right. So now everything that Danny's been working on, getting a new home for the parents and all that, it's all ripped away. And he's systematically going through the checklist. Was it Amy? Was it Edwin? What actually happened? Right. And Amy's world's starting to um, unravel as well. But again, I can never really always get there with Amy because it's the creators are always allowing the main characters to blame other things for their actions, right? They're never just, they did something and these are the consequences of your action. These are the people you hurt. Now you got to pay the price. Nope. It's blame her mom and dad, blame her past. Then when things start happening, it's this problem, it's that problem. She's blaming Danny for things Danny didn't do. Danny's blaming her for things that she didn't do. It's all a big mess, right? And he's catfishing George, pretending to be this dude. It's just like everything is, and actually everything works way better than I'm giving it credit for. The show is pretty solid with how it moves forward. But where I have a problem is kind of at the end. It culminates with this big sort of attack on the wealthy lady's house, stealing all this art or whatever. And Danny races away at one point. He doesn't understand the little kids in the back. So now he's a kidnapper. So it's really, really a big mess. But it leaves people dead. Paul has to jump a fence, and you don't know if he's hurt or not. And you end up with like another crazy Amy versus Danny chase scene. I actually thought there's like I just watched the episode. I had to rewind it because I thought just Amy went over the side, but this little cliff basically they both do, and that's kind of where the finale kind of comes into play. And it was the finale that I just can't get there. I just couldn't sort of like get my head around like what am I supposed to get out of this episode? Because I just didn't care for it. I just didn't like it. I just didn't think it was that good. So, because everything about the final episode, it just got strange. Like it starts off with these crows, and the crows are like talking to each other. It's like a very ridiculous effort at sort of like a metaphor of why the crows attack and, oh, this human did this to me. And literally there's like subtitles of the crows talking with one another before you get to this part. And then we spend the entire episode, or almost all of the episode, with them just sort of in the woods and out here lost and screaming at each other and trying to help each other, but not helping each other. And then they decide to eat these berries, which make them sick, and just all of this stuff. And it's supposed to be, or the end result is about bonding. They hallucinate about being each other and stuff. And it's like, literally, this is the whole episode. There's no Paul. There's no George. We get nothing. I'm like, what is happening? Um, and then you end up with this big finale where, they're walking out together, and then you see them making their way, and then it's George running up. Let me get to the shot real quick so you can see. Nope, can't get it the right frame. Here we go. Let me get it right here. Yeah, George runs up and shoots him. So that's George's arc. So what? And then they're in the hospital. We'll get to the finale more in a minute. So, the mom is fine. The mom is just rich lady who spends a lot. Okay, that's fine. I don't know that that's changed. I never really cared for Danny's parents. They come into town, they're disappointed, they lecture, they leave again. I'm like, I don't understand why they're always going back to Korea, by the way. It's like he has work there, but why couldn't he just get work here? It seems, anyway. I don't really care for George because the arc is early on, he wouldn't use the gun. He wouldn't stand up for himself, the family, whatever. Here he does it, even though that's the wrong thing to do, because he's just running on pure emotion. He's not significantly, the emotional arc is pretty much the same. And part of his change, in addition to the Amy stuff, which is weird because he's coming to defend Amy, is the fact that she and the mom made him think he's the hero in some of this because he sold his chair that was $100,000 or whatever. But that was a lie. They didn't need that. They didn't need it to happen. But he does this and he behaves irrationally. The problem is, this is the final episode. I'm like, I wish this had happened like 3 episodes ago. Or it just seems like maybe that's season 2. Maybe now he is the irrational person. He is the road rage person. He has become the person that they are. He's gotten to a tipping point. That is interesting. Up until this point, it's like getting him to there, but not. It's one of the more challenging ways to kind of review the show and assess it, because I like what they do with George in some ways, but that's only going to work if they're going to do more with him. If it's just like it is, I'm like, what's the point? If Amy's going to be with Danny now, which is kind of how the show implies, even though I don't think we should believe that, but that's what's implied. Why is he there? I mean, he's done everything he can do to alienate himself. Now, I'm sure he just feels guilty. Like, I didn't want her to die. I just wanted a divorce. She's a crazy person. She cheated. All the stuff that poor George has gone through. Right? Fine. You're the good dad. You should have gotten the kid. Okay. Then why are you there? We don't get told. We don't have a scene. We don't have like anything about him. It's just about Danny and Amy, who at this point, I gotta be honest, I'm sort of like sick of. Episode 10 spent so much time with this almost like shoehorning a reason for them to be together, hallucinating, all this. I'm like, ugh, they might as well just screw it in the woods and just made it complete. Like, it was just, I don't know. So many other interesting things. Now, Paul, who Danny thought had gotten shot by the police during the ridiculous robbery situation, but Paul's just alive out there. We don't see him on screen. It just happens through text. The show likes a lot of text, by the way, which when you're streaming, it's not always easy to enjoy because, maybe you look down, you might have missed something. Sometimes it's hard to read the text. I found that in a completely different show, by the way, but it's like they would show the text. I would have to pause and I'm like trying to read the text because it's not zoomed in enough. I'm like, oh my gosh, you guys are killing me. It's just the fact that Paul's not there. Like, we don't have a hospital scene of reconciliation. He's just out there. Almost anything that works with the show only works if it's predicated that there's more, bear with me, more beef to come. Someone else will have more beef, whether it be Paul, whether it be George, whether things like that. As far as Amy and Danny, I've enjoyed the fact that this has all sort of happened, but never once am I really cheering for either one of them. I'm never really rooting for them to get their hopes and dreams. I'm actually rooting against them most of the time because there's always a dodginess. There's always a scheme. There's always some element that keeps them from paying the piper for the things that they've done to literally everyone around them, including the people that they love the most. They're just so selfish and self-absorbed and narcissistic and basically evil. It's just shocking, and it's meant to shock you. So what's the point of the show then? Is the point of the show that we will just all get there, and we're all just so close to becoming that person? I'm like, that's fine. It's just that, you know, a lot of it a lot of it's been done before, and I don't it never makes me feel what am I supposed to empathize with? Let me get this straight. A woman that's worked her professional career, who now blames her parents for being the basket case that she is. She's going to make millions of dollars, but she finds her husband boring, so she cheats on him with a kid that she's lied to catfish. And because she's having a bad day, she ends up in this road rage um, revenge scheme that keeps escalating. Right? Is what about any of this is someone I should be quote empathy for? Now, it'd be different if one of the I will say this: they try in some ways to put the foot on the brake for one character, and then the other character won't let it go. But they also sabotage that along the way. Like Danny has moments, but then Danny doesn't want to take responsibility. He at least so the idea of them taking responsibility is they will just confess. So Danny will finally confess. Oh yeah, the house burned down was no one's fault but mine. I did the wiring wrong. I just didn't want to tell anybody. Right? I didn't tell you, Paul, that I threw away your college applications. I'm like, but that doesn't create empathy. You're just shaking your head that the character is catching up to where you are as an audience member. And I'm like, okay, now the story begins for Paul, not for Danny. I already know Danny. Danny's a freaking scumbag in this equation. What does Paul do now? What does George do now? But it's what happens now, not what actually happened in the show. And I think that's the problem. It can be dark and it can be interesting and show humanity's hardships and problems and struggles, and all of that's fine. But the problem is that they're purposely trying to blend this sort of like misplaced dark humor with existential questions that they don't ever have to answer. They just kind of keep going. So it's about caricatures and look at how deep we are, but we don't really ever do anything. We just keep going. And you're like, okay. So the show ends and you end up with like monster versus monster, and so and so's okay, but not okay. I don't know. I don't know how I feel about it. Like it's really one of these shows where it's not bad. It's a good show, but it's not a show that, like, I don't want to say you won't enjoy it. It's like, this is not some positive, uplifting thing. There's no real like spiritual awakening. There's no, and trust me, anytime there's a redemption moment or you think they're going to turn the other cheek or maybe try to find a way to right the ship, they really haven't, and they end up doing something significantly worse than they did before to someone else, which should be their loved one. So it's a very messy show. I will say this: I appreciate it mostly for being bold and trying something a little bit different. I just feel like there's a lot of time wasted with that jump. We had this time jump, and it disrupts our tone and our pace a little too much. And then we have this sort of like rush chaos of episode 9 and this massive letdown for a finale where it's all about Danny and Amy. And I'm like, well, yeah, but the real story is with Paul and George. We just don't really do much with their story. Really, sort of like left hanging out here to deal with. And it's like, oh well, Amy and Danny will be a thing now. And you're like, but are they really? I mean, and why would they? I mean, it's like, I don't know. It's almost like Nightingale effect or something. It's an interesting show. I think it's overhyped by people who can see themselves maybe in Amy and Danny, the empathy thing, the sympathy thing. Maybe you shouldn't be held account for some decisions that you've done because if people understood the bad day you were having, that makes it okay. Yuck. Like the one of the points of all of this is self-control. The discipline and self-control and persevering away from your mistakes and learning from your past. These people just keep Well, you think that was horrible? Well, look at this. You think that was horrible? What about this? It's like, I mean, there were episodes where I was cheering for Isaac more than I was cheering for Amy and Danny. That's not a good thing. He's an awful character. He's an awful person. I don't want to cheer, but it was interesting. And it's like, I don't know. So anyway, that's my take on Beef. B minus. Probably won't watch again. If there's a season 2, I would appreciate a recap for season 1, so I don't have to sit through the whole thing again. I'd only be interested in episode 1 or 2 because I want to see if we are going to deal with the George Paul factor. Like, if we're going to see more of their story arc, like, wouldn't that be interesting? Where it's Beef season 2 and it's not really about Danny and Amy, it's more about George and Paul. That actually is more interesting than what I just watched, but maybe I'm wrong. Anyway, love to hear your take. I know that Beef is sort of one that I think a lot of the critics and fans are kind of good reviews, still have a lot of qualifications. Bad reviews say a lot of good things. So it's kind of an interesting show in that regard. It's not for everyone, but it's also not bad. I don't know. I've danced all around long enough. That's my take on it. I am Pops.